I want to thank all of you for the vital work that you do in our nation's libraries and archives. The advent of digitization and large-scale projects like those Readex has undertaken has really revolutionized the research processes and methodologies for historians like me. You know, I can access all of these amazing documents from the comfort of my own living room, which is lovely. I don't even have to get out of my pajamas. And the fact that they are searchable really cuts down on the time that historians need to really troll through a large number of documents. And as you know, librarians have been vital to this process of sort of curating these documents and getting them ready for digitization. But you are also irreplaceable resources in brick and mortar reading rooms. I can't tell you how many times a librarian has brought me a source as I've been sitting in the room, and the librarian just sort of knows my general topic area, and he or she has brought me this source that I never would have found otherwise, either because it was uncatalogued or because it was sort of deeply ingrained in the memory of the librarian, that they had seen this image somewhere and then they went and hunted it down for me and found it. So some of those I'm going to show you today, although I can't show you all of them because literally hundreds of images and other documents that librarians have helped me to find and look at. So on behalf of historians everywhere, I thank you for all the hard work that you do, because it makes the work that we do possible. So I'm here to talk to you this morning about the importance in the Civil War era of visual images, particularly visual images of trees. Now, this may seem a little bit odd. Why look at trees to get at human experiences of warfare in the past? Well, I am both a cultural historian and an environmental historian. Throughout my career, my research has centered particularly on Southern environmental history, in particular the South's marginalized landscapes, its edge spaces. My first book was a cultural history of the Okefenokee Swamp, if we have any Georgians or Floridians in the room. There you go, yes, so you know the Okefenokee. My second book, which I'll be talking about in part today, is about the ruins that the American Civil War created. And my third project, which Remmel made reference to, which I'm working on right now, examines the southwestern deserts and the challenges that they pose to those who would try to civilize and conquer them during the American Civil War. So these landscapes, swamps and ruins and deserts, are really interesting to me because despite the fact that they are collectively considered useless, or ugly or kind of terrifying places, or perhaps maybe because of this, they have drawn a huge variety of communities into their midst. These communities usually come into conflict, and these violent interactions in edge places have been the subjects of my research and writing. And in order to figure out exactly what went on during these conflicts, I have used and still use interdisciplinary methodologies. So this means I read all of the traditional historical sources, diaries and letters and newspaper articles and military records, but I also read fiction and poetry. I examine architecture and the landscape and other forms of material culture, and I spend a lot of time looking at pictures. There are 41 images in Ruined Nation, which as book people you likely know is an insane number for an academic book. Usually the average is about 5 to 10. So I negotiated for that incredibly large number with the University of Georgia Press because I knew how important visual images were going to be to this project. And that's still a very small percentage of the overall number of images I actually looked at. So I look at a couple different kinds. I look at images that people, particularly soldiers, sketched in the margins of their letters or in their diaries. And this is one thing that digitization can bring us that transcription cannot, right? You get that visual image of the page, and you can see that there is an illustration there, a little sketch or a map or a little doodle that some soldier has made. I also look at newspaper illustrations. That's probably the largest kind of critical density of images that I look at. Most of the time, the images in newspapers were produced by soldier artists, and they were referred to as soldier artists, who were attached to or embedded in armies all over in all of the theaters. Or they were produced by sketch artists who were working from photographs. So that's newspaper illustrations are really interesting because sometimes you'll see like there was a whole spread on Antietam that used all the Gardner photographs of Antietam with some slight differences. The sketch artists for the newspaper made some changes depicting people walking and doing things that you could not depict in photographs at this time. I also look a lot at lithographs and engravings. They became very popular during this period, printing from an engraved stone or metal plate, and then also, of course, photographs and stereographs, which most of you are probably familiar with. We have a sort of amazing array of images, especially from the Eastern Theater, photographs and stereographs, because photographers also attached themselves to armies and kind of went along with their wagons, took pictures of soldiers, took pictures of battlefields, camps, all kinds of elements of this Civil War landscape. And the Civil War era was really a rather amazing time for the production of visual images. The technologies used to replicate and distribute them developed really rapidly in the 1860s, and they were incredibly influential in shaping the lives and the views of Civil War Americans. So I use these images in two different ways in my work. First, as historical evidence. So even though all images, and you know, I try to make sure that my students understand this, especially from the very start. All visual images are mediated, right? There's someone there who's shaping the view, who's, you know, sort of manipulating the frame. So images are never whole truth. They never just say, okay, this is exactly what it looked like. But despite this, visual images do offer proof in many ways of the conditions in Civil War camps and battlefields and the roads and paths between them and how Americans experienced these places. I also use visual images as material objects in their own right, as objects that circulated during the war, that soldiers would sort of trade with one another, that they would read in camp and hand to one another and sort of own and cut out and paste into albums. And that this really shaped the way, sort of treating these images as objects, shaped the way that Americans understood the war and all that it meant to them. So almost every image that you will see today as part of my talk is produced by a Northerner and depicts Union Army scenes. So why is this? Well, for three reasons. One, just as Union soldiers outnumbered Confederate soldiers by a factor of 4 to 1, Union photographers and artists outnumbered Confederate photographers and artists by about the same margin. The North also dominated the publishing industry in both newspapers and magazines and other forms of artistic production like lithography studios, so they were just producing more visual images on a regular basis during the war. Also, this bias really reflects the nature of my research. I received funding from 13 libraries, historical societies, and archives for my ruination research. 9 were in the North, and 4 were in the South. So this is just another way in which kind of libraries shape the way historians do their work that is really important to the arguments that we make. All right, so now on to the trees. So once you start looking for trees, they are everywhere in Civil War visual culture. Sometimes they are the focus of the image, like this newspaper illustration of a Louisiana oak that was supposed to be 500 years old. It was just enormous. So here was a way for people to engage with the southern landscape through a tree. It was evidence of natural fecundity and the long histories of the natural world. Other times, trees could be evidence of death in the field of battle, as in this particular image, in which a tree is used as a grave marker for James B. McPherson, a Union general who died in the Battle of Atlanta in 1864. Most of the time, however, trees functioned as background or framing devices for artists and photographers, or they appeared in other guises. So these images of trees where they appear in kind of different and interesting forms are very rich and evocative texts that tell us a great deal about the relationships between soldiers and civilians and southern forests during the American Civil War. They tell us about how soldiers changed the land and how natural resources shaped strategies and campaigns. And they tell us about how Civil War landscapes were sites of both destruction and construction. So soldiers destroyed forests in order to build other landscapes, most of which were new landscapes in the American scene, as we will see. These landscapes were just as meaningful as the materials out of which they were built, and they were the landscapes that made waging war possible. So one of the things that Civil War historians don't think about over much, but visual artists think about a lot, is transportation networks. Bridges, roads, railroads. We don't often think of these environments as landscapes, these things as landscapes. A road, is it a landscape? My argument is yes. These are landscapes of mobility, created to move people and animals through other environments, linking landscapes to one another in a larger network. So during the Civil War, rivers and swamps were the greatest challenges to moving armies along a transportation network. And so bridges in particular became targets for destruction. Burn a bridge behind you and the enemy cannot follow. This defensive strategy, of course, necessitated a lot of rebuilding, which necessitated a lot of trees. So 3 different groups worked together to assemble these structures. Each army had a corps of engineers, usually educated men who had experience building structures like this. Pioneer brigades, which were usually staffed by African Americans, free in the north and enslaved laborers in the south. And then also companies of soldiers who were detailed for the work. They would march into camp and then their commanding officer would say, you're going out. To cut wood and build. So looking at trees not only tells us about transportation networks, but it tells us about wartime labor and who did that work. A lot of times we just think, oh, it's war, people are just shooting at each other, right? There's a lot of work that goes into waging war. This work was hard and it was dangerous. These men, pioneer brigades in particular, who often moved ahead of the army and cut trees in their paths and sort of were along the front lines, often came under fire. So here's an illustration of one of these moments where Union workers are out kind of cutting trees, and you can see them doing that work here, but then in the middle ground of the image, you see the smoke from the fire of firing Confederate rifles, where they're getting shot at doing this work, and so of course they have to flee. So sometimes these workers came under fire doing this work, and sometimes, they were allowed to go about their business without such dangers. They used stone sometimes to build bridges, but the vast majority of the time they used trees. So this is a Timothy O'Sullivan stereograph. He's one of the most prolific photographers of the war, working for Gardner and for Matthew Brady. And here we see this image of a group of men building a rather sort of short bridge over a very deep sort of ravine with a river, kind of part of the Rappahannock. So you can see just from this image how much wood is being used to construct this bridge, and that they've just cut it and they've moved it because the bark is still on. So these men cut, transported, and assembled hundreds of thousands of trees over the course of the Civil War in order to build some these kinds of bridges, to sort of to get armies and wagons across little waterways like this, but also more impressive examples of transportation infrastructure in the nation at that time. Joel Cook, a Philadelphia journalist traveling with the Army of the Potomac during the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, was really awestruck by one of these kind of roadway bridges that he saw, a mile-long road and a 200-yard long and 15-foot wide bridge that spanned the Chickahominy River in the Virginia Peninsula. The bridge, he wrote, is firm and solid as a rock. Piles, beams, and braces, all of rough-hewn timber, support a corduroy roadway which is capable of bearing the heaviest burdens. So this photograph by D.B. Woodbury is a photograph of that roadway and bridge across the Chickahominy and through its kind of swampy bank. So this is one of the great ways that images work in concert with written sources, where we can sort of see what he's actually talking about and why he may have been so impressed about this road, where you can see these wagon trains and horses are moving along it and having no kind of trouble. So the construction of bridges was an almost daily activity while armies were on the move, as was road building. And you see this is kind of a hybrid of a road and a bridge. Both armies built roads through dense forests and tangled swamps, like the Chickahominy. They also built roads where roads had actually been before, which is odd. But now there was only mud. So almost all of Virginia's roads, and Virginia was the most intensively fought over landscape in the entire war, especially the strip between Richmond and Washington, D.C., sort of 100-mile corridor, fought over multiple times every year. Almost all of these roads in this area were basic dirt roads, with the exception of the Shenandoah Valley's Central Turnpike, which had a macadamized or crushed stone surface. And so when it rained, which those of you who are Southerners, you know it often rains. In Virginia and other parts of the South, when it would rain, the dirt became this dense, sticky mass that tenaciously clung to wagon wheels and soldiers' boots, as we can see in this Edwin Forbes image, through the wilderness where these poor horses are trying to drag this cannon through the mud, and it's just sticking to their wheels. And when you read soldiers' letters and diaries, they complained about mud the most, right? That they had to slog their way at the beginning, particularly of the spring campaign, because all the snow would melt and then the rains would come and then the roads were just a mess. To deal with this, pioneer corps laid down what they called corduroy roads in many places, and these were all made of trees. To build them, they laid down tree trunks and limbs kind of horizontally side by side on the surface of the mud, anchoring them with wooden piles that they drove down vertically through the soil until they came to rest on bedrock, and then adding cross layers of planks and logs. So again, here's D.B. Woodbury, who seems to have kind of an obsession with road building in his photography, and he captures this group of men, group of soldiers at work, and you can see they're just laying down the road right on the mud, right? Because it is just going to be easier and faster for those wagons to get through there if they build these roads. So they also, and you can see kind of in the background of this image, the sort of wide expanse cutting through the forest. And another thing that soldiers did was they cut trees along the roadway. They widened roads so that all of their teams and armies could get through there. Because, you know, think about this. These are groups of anywhere from 30,000 to 100,000 men moving through with animals and wagons through these places. It's sort of astonishing. And they were churning up the soil all the time. And so they would cut trees on the roadsides to help them go through there. And there's a great, for environmental historians, there is a great irony here, right? Because you cut down the trees in a wider and wider path, then there's no longer anything to anchor the soil when it rains, it erodes, it creates more mud. So then you have to build more corduroy roads and cut more roadside trees down in this sort of cycle of erosion and mud creation. So movement was an almost constant feature of life during the American Civil War for soldiers, and it was made possible by the daily destruction of trees. But when soldiers finally stopped moving and they threw down their knapsacks, they continued this process of destructive creation that left the marks of war on the southern countryside. So soldiers built all kinds of camps all over, mostly the South. There were some in the North, but mostly this is a Southern landscape feature. They could be small, they could be huge, they could be filled with just shelter tents, which was a basic kind of piece of fabric for short rests, or a Sibley tent, which looks kind of more conical, or basic A-frames for overnight stays. And these camps really they were of great interest to artists. So we have this amazing profusion of images, both photographs, but also lithographs and newspaper illustrations of these places. And they were particularly interested in winter quarters. So when the temperatures fell in about November or early December, basically the fighting season was over in most places. So both sides would sort of settle down, they'd pick a spot, and they would build a winter camp for themselves, which they would refer to either as winter quarters or as their camp villages, which is an interesting term, right, for the middle of a war. So here's an image of a somewhat typical small camp for just one regiment, the 6th Massachusetts in Suffolk, Virginia. And you can see that they've kind of laid out the camp a little bit in a nice little grove. They've got a whole range of sort of houses and structures here, which I'll talk about in a minute. One Northern soldier described the process of converting forests to camps in 1863. Let as many men as there are go into a piece of woodland to camp, and in half a day, where the giants of the forest stood in all of their towering majesty, a large city of tents with their inhabitants will appear, putting one in mind of the Arabian tales. So when they knew for sure that they were going to remain for a few weeks or more, soldiers almost immediately set to work on what they variously referred to as their huts, cabins, shanties, houses, or in some cases, log palaces. The most common form of the winter house was a tent pitched on a foundation or what they called a stockade of logs, as pictured here in Edwin Forbes's image, Home Sweet Home, where you can see these two soldiers have combined. They've combined their tents to create the roof for this structure, and then they've gone out, and here's another structure in which they have not taken the bark off the tree. They've just dragged it. It's been cut and dragged into camp. And they have put it together, usually using that great Virginia mud, again, to bind it all together. And they've built also themselves a fireplace and a chimney made of stone and mud, which often worked. Sometimes it got a little melty and collapsed upon itself, which created great kind of both humor in camp and also a big problem, because then they had to build their chimney again. So soldiers often had the time and the resources to build more permanent lodgings even than this. In this case, the single-room log hut, which was built entirely of wood, with horizontally laid logs and a single doorway, became the dominant structure in long-term winter camps. So this is an image, again, by a Northern photographer, but this time of a Confederate camp. George Bernard gained access to this camp after the Confederates left it outside Manassas, Virginia, when they went out for their spring campaign. They abandoned these camps. So there are these sort of abandoned camps all over the place. Sometimes they would burn them, sometimes they would just leave them. Luckily for us, George Bernard was able to snap a picture of this camp where you can see this sort of interesting variety of structures here. A lot made of wood and tree, obviously tree trunks, but then some of these roofs are of course much smoother than that. They are probably fence rails. Virginia lost probably close to 100% of its fences during the war because soldiers pulled them apart to either build fires for themselves or to put roofs on structures like this. So typically, the construction of these more elaborate winter quarters took the time and the talents of the entire regiment. Most soldiers were from rural areas, and they used their knowledge of clearing woodlands and erecting farmhouses and outbuildings in order to build camp houses. Other soldiers had professional expertise. They were carpenters, or they worked in sawmills, and they made themselves very useful. This is why a lot of Northern soldiers really wanted to become friends with all the regiments from Maine. because there were a lot of woodcutters and a lot of sawmill operators who could work their magic in camp for Maine. Many soldiers watched these carpenters work and they just learned from them, and others improvised and built from instinct and sort of learned from their mistakes, because they often built 5 or 6 different houses for themselves during winter quarters. The ways that the rank and file went about building their shelters was impressive. They display a great deal of ingenuity in the construction of their tents, one Massachusetts officer wrote to his family. They appropriate to their use wood, stones, earth, turf, and brush from trees, and straw, and various other things. They succeed in making themselves quite comfortable. So soldiers built houses for themselves. In addition to this, they also built furniture. When there were no nearby houses to loot, this is how they would get some of their furniture, soldiers constructed desks, bookshelves, chairs, and most critically, beds. Many soldiers were proud of these architectural accomplishments, and they wrote home about them obsessively in their letters to their families. While writing a detailed description of his building process, Massachusetts soldier Charles Morse drew this sketch of his log house in a letter to his father in the winter of 1863. So again, this is both the benefit of looking at an original document and then digitizing rather than transcribing it, because then you can see this marvelous little sketch that Morse made just in the middle of his letter. You can see it's just, he kind of shoves it in here to show it to his father. He was really proud of it. Over that winter, Morse built 5 different houses as the 2nd Massachusetts moved from winter camp to winter camp. A little bit later in March, he wrote to his mother and included a floor plan of another house that he built, identifying, as you can see, the location of the door, the fireplace, his bunk, a desk, and a chair. So he's got quite the nice little setup here. So these houses, what you can get from this is that these houses, you know, they took labor. They were for protection. They were for survival, because if you are also from the South, you know it does get cold, especially in the upper South. You can get snow, you can get ice storms. Temperatures fall into the, you know, below freezing quite often. And they were really exposed to the elements, and so they wanted to protect themselves. But these houses also, I think, did something for soldiers' emotional and psychological well-being in camp. By building these structures and filling them with sort of domestic items, they created a real comforting sense of home and belonging in this landscape of war. So this is one of my favorite images that I found in all of my research of winter camps. So this is called Pine Cottage. You can see that this is in a lot of different collections, but I believe it's an unattributed photograph. But this is probably from the Brandy Station winter quarters in the winter of 1863. But I just love the posing of this photograph, that all of these guys are standing outside. They've obviously posed for it, because it would take about a minute or 2 during this period to kind of set the camera, and none of them look blurry, so they had to sort of stop moving and pose, right? So we've got a guy with a broom, we have a guy shining his shoes, we've got another guy with a shovel. I do not know what the man on the roof is doing. It seems like he's up to no good, and he's maybe a little mischievous. But clearly, I mean, look at this house. This is sort of an amazingly constructed house that has both a door and also windows. There's a window here, and there's a window on the gable end in the top. So they have clearly built this house with great care, and then they have given it a name. Pine Cottage, and they clearly identify it here, right? Identify with it as their own log house. They also often gave their houses addresses, because when they built these camps, they actually had to build in rows. Regiments had to build in rows, much like a gridded town plan, which emerged during this period, before this period, in the antebellum period, as a way to structure towns and villages. So they had these streets. This was called Company F Street. which is not a particularly imaginative name for their street. But this is where Company F Street was hanging out. And the photographer clearly loved this whole idea of there being a street in camp, and all of the men are assembled with the houses that they had built. And what you can see also, so they built a corduroy road, so the same technique that they used to build a transportation network, they used in camp to build the road in between these structures. And then they also built a sort of on-ramp, as you can see. So a sort of entrance way so that you knew you were sort of stepping up and into Company F Street. So soldiers, you know, this was part of the camp village landscape that they created, all built, as you can see, of wood. They also built stables and kitchens, in some cases, opera houses and theaters, and quite often, chapels. So some chapels that soldiers constructed were, you know, quite small structures, about the size of 2 or 3 huts combined. Others, like this one, were enormous. You can see there are 2 men actually here for size comparison. So here's one guy, here's another. So Union soldier John West Haley spent the winter of 1864 and 65 in camps outside Petersburg, Virginia, and he was amazed to find several chapels in this vicinity erected since we came here. There was one large one that would seat 500 or more. At this one, services were held every evening. Now, Haley was probably talking about this church, Poplar Grove, which was built by the 50th New York Engineers and their pioneer brigade during the siege of Petersburg in 1864. Now, as you can see, this is a substantial structure. Did they need to add that gigantic steeple? No, they did not, right? So our question is, why did they do such things, right? Because they wanted it to look like and be a real chapel in this landscape, recognizable as such, a place where they could gather together for religious worship, again, every day, if they wanted to. And that this would be like a ritual also of home. Poplar Grove, incidentally, was still standing when the Northern journalist J.T. Trowbridge visited the former camp in 1866, after the war had ended, in Virginia, and it was in use. The Union regiments had presented it to local residents as a replacement for their own church, which had been destroyed during the siege. Such structures provided a sense of community and made the landscape of war feel more like home, like the towns that these men had grown up in. And this helped to really boost morale in camp. One additional fascinating element of this wartime landscape, which Civil War historians have never really noted or talked about, is the fact that soldiers not only cut down trees to build their camps, they cut down trees to beautify them. So this is just one of many, many images. Photographers and illustrators were totally fascinated by this also, because one of the things that soldiers did in camp was to go out and cut trees and bring them back to camp and transplant them, to act solely as either shade trees or as decoration. So this is the camp of the 3rd New Hampshire, and they were posted in South Carolina. So they were functionally posted on the beach on one of the outlying islands outside of Charleston. They went out into the surrounding forest, cut down these longleaf pines, brought them back, and planted them in front of their tents. And you can see over here a little bit, there is a bench. So that you can sit and have a contemplative moment in your man-made forest on the beach. Very strange, and yet completely awesome. And there's another photograph, which I don't have here, but where there are tents and little houses where they have built sidewalks up to the house, which they have hedged with various plants and grasses. So the 3rd New Hampshire was into this whole beautification process, but a lot of soldiers were, both Union and Confederate. There's a lot of detail in diaries and letters about soldiers going out and cutting down trees and then transplanting them in camp. Part of the reason, I mean, again, this gives, just like the houses and the villages, it gives soldiers a sense of place. And this was important because the war itself and the waging of it was so profoundly dislocating. I mean, here are millions of men who have left their homes. They've come to a place they do not know. There's basically an alien landscape to them. And that's Southerners also. They were traveling, you know, going from Louisiana to Virginia is just as bizarre and strange as going from New Hampshire to Virginia, right? So they wanted a way to kind of to remind themselves of home, which is why I think they sought out pines here, these New Hampshire guys, right? Because the beach was really freaking them out. And how flat South Carolina was really freaking them out. And of course, I mean, you think about all of this building and all this transplanting and beautification, and there was an environmental cost to all of this, right? Soldiers actively deforested large areas by building these camp villages. Some soldiers did see the cost of these projects. I have been out again with our 100 axemen, Charles Morse wrote to his mother. It is an interesting and pretty, though rather a sad sight to see so many men at work at once felling trees. After several months of building camps and cutting down trees for firewood, soldiers effectively created a landscape of stumps, a kind of growing periphery of deforestation around winter camps. And this is also one of these things, you know, you think it's sort of a chicken or egg question, but, you know, do we find this evidence in a visual image and it kind of enlightens us as to the manuscript source, or do you see it in the manuscript source and then you're able to look for it and sort of notice it in the visual image? In this case, soldiers never really commented on this. They weren't super aware, except when they had to go further and further from camp for wood. They'd say, ugh, I had to walk 3 miles for wood today. And they didn't really connect that to any kind of environmental or environmentalist kind of thinking. But when they registered that, what they were kind of seeing in their general area was a landscape of stumps. And these appear a lot in Civil War images. So this was a case where I saw it in the image before I was really seeing any kind of evidence of it in the manuscripts, and then looking kind of for it in the manuscripts. The sort of interesting way that the visual image is working with these other kinds of sources. So survival was really more important to soldiers than any kind of environmentalist or preservationist ethic. They didn't really think about this at all. They expressed really, very few of them expressed sadness at seeing trees go down. They were much more concerned about building a fire to feed themselves and building these other structures. So this desire to survive demanded the construction of camp villages and of other wartime landscapes as well. So during major campaigns, when it became clear that armies were about to clash, so they had moved out of their winter camps and they're into actual fighting season, both Southern and Northern soldiers began building a range of structures that were designed to shield their bodies from bullets, shot, and shell. Giant earthworks made of a mixture of dirt and wooden braces or gabions appeared all over the southern landscape of varying sizes. It really depended on how long they were there for the battle or if it was a siege operation. Some of these could be quite large. And we actually, this part of the landscape of war is the one that is still left to us in the landscape itself. We can still see trenches and earthworks, particularly in Virginia, where they have not yet been kind of destroyed or mowed under, you know, in suburbanization or urbanization projects. They also built what they called breastworks, which are made of wood, or they would commandeer, again, fence rails to build a structure that could protect them from rifle fire. And here you can see this process at work where you have the guys kind of lined up behind their breastwork, and then these poor unfortunate guys who've had to leap over it to go into the forest and cut wood to add to it. Right, so here again is the sort of sense of danger that perhaps they could get, you know, they're going to get shot at any moment, but they are out. And you can see here too the creation of a landscape of stumps that's sort of growing from the breastwork. Soldiers also built bomb-proof shelters, stockades and magazines for the storage of ammunition, battery platforms upon which they placed cannons, and signal towers. So all of these were elements of the protective landscape of battle during the American Civil War. All of them were either made of wood or of earth that had been cleared of its forest cover. So in both of these cases, trees are getting cut down. Fortifications also included two other features made of wood. One was called an abattis, which was just, you would cut tree limbs and just throw them at the bottom of the earthwork. And this is a very in-focus detail of an illustration from Frank Leslie's of these Union soldiers trying to get over abattis to get to the earthwork. And you can see how effective they are, right? Really big trees, you have to, if you are trying to charge on a work, this is going to stop you, or at least slow you down, which is quite beneficial for the people defending the earthwork, because then they can just shoot you down. So you see that there are men who are falling and dying in the midst of this kind of tangle of trees. There were also what they called Chevaux de Fries, which are wooden poles that are actually cut down and then shaped and sharpened and cross-hatched. So here they are in the landscape outside of Atlanta. This was a very effective defense against cavalry charges. So this is sad to think about horses kind of running up against these sharpened sticks, but this is another way in which soldiers used wood to kind of protect themselves in battle. And in this image, this is another George Bernard image. He was with Sherman during the campaign in Georgia and South Carolina, so all of the fabulous images we have of that campaign are due to Bernard and his camera. And clearly he was very interested in how this landscape of war is sort of winding its way through the landscape in Georgia. You can see the Chevaux de Fries, you can see the earthwork that they have built, or kind of breastwork part here, which has fence, this is either fence rail or they came from this house, which you can see has been stripped entirely of one side of its wall, and then stacked up, and they would fill bags with earth and stack those up as well to protect themselves. But the other interesting thing about this photo too is that you have this like one lone tree right here, and then another one across the way, right? They let those stand deliberately, right? So here again, we have this sort of sensibility of soldiers that they're either using that for shade, or they're using that for protection, or possibly just they wanted to have sort of some living thing in this landscape, which can start to look a little bit stark, right? A little bit like a moonscape when you've got that many men living in a defensive fortification for that long. So this may seem a pretty obvious point, but trees left standing were also an inextricable element of every Civil War battlefield, especially in the Eastern Theater, where Robert E. Lee manipulated the Northern Army into fights in wooded areas so that he could eliminate the Union advantage of larger numbers, because it kind of forces regiments to scatter, and it forces kind of hand-to-hand combat. Soldiers using rifles and artillery converted tree stands into the ghost forests of war during battles. These forest battles could sometimes start massive fires in which injured and dead soldiers' bodies were consumed. And this was something of great concern to Civil War Americans and to armies, and also to illustrators who thought, you know, because this is a horrible way to die in battle, right? You're injured and then the forest is on fire and you cannot get out, right? You cannot save yourself. So here is, you know, an illustration of that particularly tragic circumstance in a forest fire at the Battle of Fort Donelson. What shows up more in the visual record, though, is the impact of bullets, and especially shot and explosive shells that sheared off tree branches and sent them flying, where they could injure or kill soldiers as they were fighting in this battle. So this is one of these instances in which you look at an image and you may not notice the trees at first. This is a battle image. You might be more concerned that this is evidence of the Battle of Shiloh, and that this is part of, you know, a victorious kind of narrative of that battle, because this is the charge, a Union charge that is taking a New Orleans battery. So this is part of, you know, how the Union won this battle. But when you look at the trees more closely, you can see them getting sheared off. You can see broken limbs kind of hanging off the lower levels. And then really here you see splintered trees. And this one's totally about to go. And then it actually has a significantly large part of its trunk that has fallen off and is falling down, heading kind of right for this poor guy, right, who's on the ground and is trying to kind of defend himself, right? But you don't expect this, right? When you're a soldier, you are expecting that you're going to take fire from the enemy. You don't think that the trees around you might contribute to your demise. Because of the ubiquity of trees and the sound of bullets and shell hitting them with a thud and shearing off their limbs, soldiers often measured the ferocity of a battle not only through casualty, human casualty numbers, but by the damage done to trees. After losing several friends at the vicious Battle of Antietam, Charles Morse visited the battlefield, probably the Westwoods, with his friend Robert Gould Shaw. Everything in the vicinity is scarred by bullets, and the branches torn by shot and shell, he told his mother. No language would describe more forcibly the severity of the fight. So this is actually an image from Gettysburg, not Antietam, but photographs of torn up trees and sort of trees that had been whittled down, which a lot of people described as sort of women in corsets, whittled down by fire, were very popular images of trees and sort of ways to assess the violence of the battle during the American Civil War. And these trees became veterans in the view of Civil War Americans. And if you go to national battlefield parks today, there are often many of these veteran trees kind of labeled and standing around, and you can go see them, and they're sort of seen as, like soldiers, witnesses to history, although they clearly have outlived the soldiers who fought in the war, and they bear the marks of war. And so this is why soldiers and civilians cut pieces of trees from battlefields, or sometimes entire trunks, to take or send home as souvenirs of the war. When they saved these tree shards, and sometimes they would even cut down trees that had embedded shot and shell in them, and then they'd lacquer them up, and either kind of put them in their parlors as some kind of decoration, or sometimes they served as pedestals for busts. So there's a Gettysburg battle log at the Pennsylvania Historical Society that has a bust of Lincoln on it, and the text of the Gettysburg Address on the back. Right, so that's combining all kinds of interesting elements of the war into one material object, right? So when they saved these, you know, they gave these new objects a new kind of name, which was a battle log. So they were both tree and narrative of the war itself. They were mementos of a time and a place of great violence, and they were emblems of the Civil War and all of its costs. So when they cut down trees and built the landscapes of war, Civil War soldiers created new ways of seeing the world. And this is what looking at Civil War visual images does. These lithographs, illustrations, photographs, and sketches take historians to new places, to corduroy roads and camp villages and battlefield earthworks. They encourage us to see these places in new ways, to understand their many and diverse meanings for Civil War Americans. So in the end, more than 4 million trees were consumed during the Civil War. Pines, cedars, oaks, maples, cypresses. Cut down, burned up, notched together, laid out, transplanted. They were the material and the meaning of war. Thank you so much.